All right, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for making time to join us today for our webinar. My name is Heidi Lenffer. I work with the Ecotone Partners team as a research analyst, and it's been my great pleasure to bring together some brilliant women today who are leaders in the practice of gender lens investing to give us a simple, practical overview of this really important topic. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge today that I'm calling in from Wurundjeri country, and I want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the people of the Kulin Nation, their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend this respect to any First Nations people who are joining us on the call today. So for a bit of context for this webinar, at Ecotone Partners, a key focus of our work is to help the investment community really understand the power of their investments to drive social and environmental change in the world. And part of what we're trying to achieve is to mobilise more investor capital towards investment opportunities that have greater impacts more broadly. So today's webinar is the first in a 5-part series that we put together, focusing on different aspects of investing with a gender, as well as in the future, a climate lens. So to give you a little sneak preview into the topics coming up, after this session, we'll be doing one in a few weeks' time called the commercial case for gender lens investing, which will showcase the plethora of research that's coming up, demonstrating that gender diverse teams perform better financially. We'll also be looking at gender lens as a holistic approach to systems change. Then we'll be looking at the intersection of gender and climate and how they're inextricably linked. And then finally, we'll be showcasing 5 really interesting high impact gender and climate investment opportunities in the Asia Pacific region. So it's going to be a really interesting program with a lot of diversity in there. So I hope it provides a lot of value for you all. And we're actually thrilled to be partnering on this work with DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And DFAT have been doing a lot of gender lens investing themselves in the neighbouring Asia Pacific region, supporting women-led startups and small businesses. So DFAT have a keen interest to keep building upon that work by sharing these investment opportunities with the Australian private investor community more broadly, and to shine a light on the different approaches that investors can take to embed gender considerations as a normal part of their investment decision-making process. Now I'm going to hand over to Rachel Yang. Rachel is a partner at Giant Leap. And for those of you who don't know, Giant Leap is Australia's first 100% impact venture capital fund. They've invested in over 25 companies to date, approximately 60% of which are women-led. And we're really lucky to have Rachel leading this discussion today because she's been a true influencer in this sector. She's not only shaped the gender lens strategy for Giant Leap and created what many feel is a gold standard for the integration of gender across all aspects of an organisation, but she's also been a vocal advocate for the importance of gender as a critical point of analysis. And she's also been very generous in sharing practical elements about how she's gone about doing that, how their organisation has gone about doing that. And that's largely what today's session is about. So getting real concrete examples that you can all take back into your own work and get started on your own gender lens journey. So over to you, Rach.
Thanks, Heidi. Very kind introduction. I'm joined today by 2 wonderful panellists, Shuyin Yang and Sarah Buckley. They're also incredible women that have been leading the charge on gender lens investing. So I'm very lucky to be having this conversation with them today and really having this conversation in general on such an important topic. So Shuyin is a partner at Patamar Capital, a leading impact investment firm in Southeast Asia. She's also the co-founder and CEO of the Beacon Fund, a boundary-breaking fund for women-led businesses in Southeast Asia's emerging markets. She spearheads Patamar's gender lens investing efforts, including managing one of the first gender lens investing funds in Southeast Asia, and she's also won many awards for her incredible work. She also currently serves on the Investment Advisory Council of the Equality Fund and the Impact Investing Council of the Global Private Capital Association. And so thanks for joining us, Shuyin. Sarah joins us as the Chief of Staff of Carol Schwartz AO and the CEO for the Trawalla Foundation. The Trawalla Foundation is an incredible organisation focused on strengthening gender equality, creativity, sustainability and social justice within our society, really founded on the belief that more women leaders are really important in our society. Sarah is a collaborative, strategic and values-driven leader with over 16 years of business leadership experience in social innovation, ESG and responsible investments. Sarah has been a sought-after sustainability consultant to major Australian companies and led PwC's award-winning corporate responsibility team and held senior roles focused on creating innovative new businesses. So incredible bios, and wonderful to have you both in the room with us today. Based on these bios, you've got incredible experience in gender lens investing. So I'm keen to understand, maybe firstly starting with you, Shuyin, how you first came across investing with gender considerations.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that even for me, gender lens investing is a relatively new, new thing for myself personally, and I think also us at Patamar as well. So I only came across the term for the first time in 2017 when we commenced our work with the Investing in Women initiative, which was supported by DFAT, as you mentioned earlier. I think before then, maybe we were more like unintentional gender lens investors. We, I think, saw the importance of women in a lot of our work, right? So we invested in microfinance, for example, and it's well known that most of the borrowers in that industry are women, right? And are really key. And there's many interesting factors, right, about how to better serve their needs uniquely as women. But I would say we only had a much more intentional approach starting in 2017 and over the subsequent years as we, developed a gender lens action plan and really put in place a lot of things in our investment process and our internal operations, which I'm sure we will get into in this discussion.
And just quickly following on from that, Shuyin, just would love to understand what's a myth that you'd like to debunk today in the session?
Gosh, well, there's a few, but if I had to pick just like one or two, I mean, I think one of them is a myth that I believed when I first started gender lens investing, which is that GLI is simply about counting the number of female entrepreneurs that you've invested in. That is one part of GLI, but but it's so much more. In short, and I think the second big myth, and I'll stop here, is that men can't be gender lens investors, and I'll leave it. I'll leave it there. That's also, but I mean, it was an important part for us learning and growing as a team. Yeah.
Love that. Thanks, Shuyin. And over to you, Sarah. So just a bit about your journey in investing with a gender lens.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and definitely agree with those myths. Thanks, Shuyin. My journey, well, look, I guess you will have heard my background. I've been in the space of sustainability and ESG for a while, so I guess have always sort of seen gender diversity as being integrated into that bigger picture of how we consider, aspects of being a responsible business and how do we integrate financial, social and environmental impact. But really, I think where that journey accelerated for me was when I joined Trawalla. Many of you might be aware that Carol Schwartz is a rather incredible, formidable woman who really has gender equity truly integrated into her life in so many different ways. It's a true passion in terms of how do we get gender balance and have men and women equally sharing power, influence and decision making, particularly in Australia, but more broadly as well. So I guess it flows through naturally in all of the different aspects of my role with Carol and with Alan. But I guess, like Shuyin, it's really just something that has started quite simply when I joined 5 years ago, and we've just built on that approach over time as we've learnt, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this. There are some really exciting, innovative models that are building overseas, and really thinking about how do we start bringing some of those to an Australian context.
Right. And Sarah, any additional myths you'd like to debunk during this session?
Well, look, the one that I always push strongly on is that this isn't just about the right thing to do. This is a genuinely untapped commercial opportunity. And I know you've got, Heidi talked about the next section is going to really deep dive onto that. But I just think it's so important to keep coming back to this, that this is generally an opportunity to manage both from a risk and an opportunity perspective. And I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about it during this session too.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we really dive in deep, how do you define gender lens investing? And perhaps Shuyin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure, happy to. Always the definition question is an interesting one. I think same with impact investing, we often find. But for us, gender lens investing, we see it as an approach to investing that takes into consideration gender-based factors across the investment process, and then also within our own internal operations. And we believe this better informs our investment decisions, as well as, hopefully can also advance gender equality, right, in our work. So I think, again, like Sarah said, I think there is really strong both and, right, of helping us make better investment decisions, but then also I think keeping the impact and moral kind of case in mind, right, which is, I will say, of course, for us, important to us as well. So I think both the smart thing to do and the right thing to do. And I think both were key components in why we decided to go on our own gender lens investing journey. I think one more thing that I'd like to highlight is that, so that's the broad definition. I think, why is it called like gender lens investing? I mean, sometimes we think of it as a number of different lenses that you can apply, right? So for example, some of these lenses could include advancing women in investment roles, right? As fund managers, sitting on ICs, basically being involved in the investment decision-making process, right? So it's very key part of it. It could also mean advancing women in leadership more at the entrepreneurial level, right? So of course, female entrepreneurs is a key component, and also then advancing women in leadership in kind of startups, SMEs, investee companies more broadly. I think there's another lens which is again important, right? So, and that's around advancing products and services that can improve the lives of women and girls. And then another one that often comes up is advancing workplace equity, right, more broadly. So within these companies and through supply chains in general. And you may be thinking, oh my goodness, that's a lot of things. I'm not sure whether we can really incorporate all of those different considerations. And I think a really important thing that I would like to highlight is that, different investors, or actors might emphasize different lenses, right? Depending on what makes sense for their investment thesis and their firm, right? And it doesn't mean you get like a C- if you can only focus on one, or only one or two things are more relevant for you. It's actually, I think the important thing about gender lens investing is that it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And it really does have to be tailored to the strategy of your fund, or else I guess it won't get done, right? Put simply. So I think that's but those are some maybe lenses that can help, frame kind of the types of things you can think about, right? Then it comes down to making it relevant and applicable to the work that you do, right? And I think we can get into examples of how we did that in our case in the conversation.
It's really helpful to understand, and I think we'll dive deeper into the practical elements and the how later in the conversation, but to understand that framing is super helpful to start with. Sarah, did you have anything to add? Do you define it slightly differently or similarly at Trawalla?
Look, I think that was a really great overview in terms of kind of the spectrum of how you can look at it. A simple way of really considering how you might want to do this is it integrated? Is it just about how do you build it into your existing processes, or is it intentionally seeking out, female founder-led funds, products, founders, products? So I think that, and we do both. We do a mix of those. And sometimes, some of that integration piece can actually be quite simple. One of the things I'm always encouraging, particularly my peers in philanthropy and family offices, is just, are you asking the question? Are you asking what the balance of the investment committee is, who the fund managers are, who are the types of investments that you've got, and who are the founders, and just starting, to get a sense of what your portfolio looks like, because certainly, that was a simple way we started that journey. And whilst it meant that there were products and funds that we wouldn't consider, we found that over time, several of them came back and had really started to look at how to integrate that, or at least were starting to transition. So I think there is power even just in asking that question and thinking about where you currently stand, and then where you might start taking those incremental steps to start integrating it in.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it does sound like a bit of an evolution for each organisation. You start somewhere, and it might seem overwhelming at the beginning, but certainly taking these steps and refining along the way sounds like it's a general kind of approach. And recall at the start, Shuyin, you mentioned that your approach was unintentional to kind of begin with, and then that certainly evolved to be you becoming a leader in this space.
Yeah, and maybe I could provide a couple of like examples maybe to illustrate, I think, what Sarah said about kind of, this, like, you can either integrate it, right, or you can very actively go out and seek these opportunities, because I think we have that within our work, and maybe that helps, the audience kind of, see the different opportunities and options out there, right? So I think for us at Patamar, we actually have 2 funds where gender is at the forefront, right? I mean, so we invest in women-owned and women-led businesses, right? We've built a very diverse team, including all the way to the investment committee level. And we conduct very in-depth gender analysis, right, as part of our due diligence process. And so I mean, it's really, I would say, like quite a holistic, gender lens approach. And I think that's great. It resonates with many of our investors. However, I mean, we have a number of other funds, right, which are, I guess, impact venture capital funds, a little more akin to maybe, say, Giant Leap, right, but in Southeast Asia. And, gender is a lens, right? It's an important factor of the fund, but I wouldn't, I mean, I think it's not the core underlying kind of, reason for being, right, of the fund, and which is really about investing in early stage companies, technology companies, to transform the lives of Southeast Asia's middle class, right? So that's a bit of a different focus. I think gender is an important part of what we do, but it's more integrated into that thesis, right, rather than kind of being the reason for being, right? So I think maybe that provides an example of what we mean by that.
I might just add to that too with some examples, because I think that is often how you kind of bring this to life. And yeah, we've got, a real mix there. I mean, one of the places that we did start was, and I guess maybe good to explain, there's kind of 2 different buckets of investments that I focus on with this gender lens. One is the corpus of our family foundation, and then the other is where we've actually started building for Trawalla Group a female-led venture portfolio to really sort of start grappling with that stat that I'm sure drives us a little bit nuts, that only 3% of venture capital goes towards female founders. So there's sort of 2 different buckets. But if I talk about the corpus of the foundation, which is really where we started the journey, part of that portfolio is managed by Credit Suisse, and we decided that alongside the equity negative screenings we had, many of the sort of standard ESG ones, to apply a positive screening. So we decided we'd only invest in a company if they had a certain percentage of women on their boards. And when that journey started, which was, I think, about probably 5 or 6 years ago, that threshold had to be a bit lower, so it was 25% women on the board. But I'm really delighted in the last 6 months, I've been able to push that up to 30%. And I guess that was sort of just a relatively simple step that we could take to kind of push it ahead. It is just one metric around gender, but it was one that we could apply relatively easily. I guess alongside that, with Carol's public profile, we decided that we would also divest if they drop below the threshold, and we would publicly make note of that. So whilst we'd be a relatively small investor, that Carol could use her voice to do a little bit of that naming and shaming, and really encouraging companies to maintain the gender balance that many of them have committed to. So that's just one example. I guess we then have a whole spectrum of different funds that we invest in, and as Shuyin said, whilst the main focus isn't gender, we always will ask that question about who's on the investment committee and what the focus is, and really encourage them to kind of keep strengthening and improving that process. I was talking to Rachel and Shuyin as we were preparing for this, that I think one of sort of the great examples of this is Giant Leap, which we are investors in, because it's not an explicit focus of the fund, but it is very intentionally curated into the way Giant Leap runs the fund. Or maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, Rachel, so jump in if that's not fair. But, we've been so impressed by that gender balance of the businesses that you invest in, but also how you work with the founders to strengthen it if it's something that needs to be addressed. I don't know, Rachel, if you wanted to jump in and say anything there.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, you've described it exactly how we kind of describe it in terms of being just part of how we operate. Is we want to be an inclusive fund and attract founders from all walks of life, whether that be differences in kind of gender or ethnicity. We just want to make sure that we're inclusive, and how that's played out is that we do have a diverse founding teams in our portfolio, and so we're really proud of that, but we can always do better, and so that's something we ensure that we work on continuously, is having a policy and targets to ensure that day to day we are continuing to improve and being as inclusive as possible to be reflective of the population when we're thinking about our investments.
And really, you know,
I think
would you not say, Rachel, really that's almost the ideal state? If we could get to that with gender lens investing, where that was just the way things were done, I think that would be just a huge success story.
And that's absolutely how we'd love to see the world in future, is that it's not a conversation we're continuing to have, it's just the way that people invest. And I think the recurring theme that seems to be coming through is that it's not just about the investment itself, but there are lots of different things to think about in terms of the way that you operate internally, as well as, you know, even divestment away from investments that you've made, or avoiding investments that might not meet the standards. So I think there's a lot of ways we can think about gender lens investing, and hopefully it does become the norm in future and just the standard way of investment. So with that in mind, and thanks for those great examples from both of you as well, and kind of some even small actions that people can take and some targets that people can set as a starting point. Just staying on that kind of idea of the definition of gender lens investing, there's another definition I wanted to touch on and ask you both about, and that's intersectionality. And people talk a lot about the kind of notion of intersectionality and may not necessarily know what that means, or know what that means in an investing context. So how do you think about it, and what does it really mean?
Shall I take a stab? I have to say we're still, you know, I think this is one that was highlighted to us, I think in the last few years, right? Because I think we first started on this gender lens investing journey, and then people were like, wow, you know, you focus very much on gender. What about all of these other aspects, right? Other socioeconomic considerations, what about ethnicity, et cetera, and also then how does it apply in, say, the context that we work, which is Southeast Asia, which is obviously a bit different to Australia. I would say we're paying more and more attention. I think one of the things that did strike us quite early on in our investing work, for example, was that like many of the entrepreneurs that we invested in had great educations, often overseas, international educations, had come back to, say, Vietnam, Indonesia, and were from, I would say, a pretty privileged part of society, right? And I think if you're founding a tech startup in this part of the world, that's probably your profile and background. And I think we did interrogate how much are we, what are we missing, right? By looking at these, or mainly this class or segment of entrepreneurs, right, versus kind of going broader and deeper, and looking for people who might be a bit more scrappy, right? Might not speak great English, but then actually could perhaps be even better attuned to the needs of the customer segment they are serving, right? And in that way, actually honestly be better at building particular business models. So I think that's one conversation, I think more around, say, their socioeconomic background that we've been looking into, I think, in our work, and that's how maybe intersectionality feeds in. I think we also noticed that as we shifted, or as we, so now we don't only invest in startups, tech startups, right? We also invest in, I guess, SMEs, right? Or the missing middle of companies. I mean, I think that also attracts a very different profile and background of entrepreneur as well. So those are maybe some practical things that we've been doing. I think, of course, we, intersectionality, it's real, right? We do try and keep all these different factors at top of mind in our work, and not make it just about gender, right? Which can, yes, be a bit exclusive, right, if that was the only consideration. But I would say it's still, like with all of us, right, I think an evolving journey of how we put that into practice. And we're beginning to track more data on this as well, right? And I think seeing that other investors are also beginning to ask these questions.
That's great. Sarah, anything to add there in terms of the way you think about intersectionality when you're thinking about gender as well?
Look, I think it's a really important question, and all of the data shows, I said that 3% stat, and gosh, that number must drop even lower when you're taking into account all of those different elements of intersectionality as well. So it's a really important part of kind of how we evolve what's happening in this space. I think, Shuyin mentioned data. There's a big gap. I mean, we're not even really measuring or understanding this stuff. Because we're not sort of as active in sort of curating our portfolio, we're more having to then rely a bit on where the capability of the funds are at as well. So, I think it's a conversation we have. I think there's an acknowledgement more needs to be done. I'm hopeful that we will start to see focus on this. Certainly you can see that in the context of what's happening in the US particularly, but also, some of the work that's happening, gender lens investing is almost taken off more in developing countries perhaps than it has in some of the more developed countries. So I think we're learning partly from what's happening there. I guess from our perspective, some of the way we're trying to tackle that cultural diversity, we don't invest just in Australia, but we invest all around the world. And so, we're having some amazing conversations with fantastic female fund managers in different parts of Asia and Africa as well. So I guess that's one practical way to tackle this while we're still grappling with it, particularly in an Australian context. I don't think it's strongly part of the conversation yet.
Yeah, and I think we do have just a way to go in the gender conversation alone. I read that Australia ranks 50th out of 153 countries in closing the gender gap. So we do have some work to do. What problems do you think that gender lens investing can solve, and what are the risks on the flip side of that, of ignoring gender considerations from your perspective?
Sarah, do you want
to? Sure, yeah. You've sort of been taking this with me. Look, I mean, the momentum is there both from the risk and the opportunity perspective. I mean, it's quite incredible some of the regulation that's coming into place in different parts of the world. Some of it's relatively simple, whether it's around transparent public reporting from companies, but right through to kind of requirements for women on boards of companies. Some of them are the ones we know about, like the US and UK, but this is happening in Hong Kong, even India. There's some real momentum. We're starting to see, even here in Australia, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency really ramping up the mandate that they have. You might have even, seen Matt Keane sort of talk about wanting to have a corporate sort of heroes list, or a bit of a similar sort of naming and shaming going on. So there's clearly a focus on the need for greater diversity in the way many of these companies are running. I think you're seeing it in terms of employee and public expectations, but there's all sorts of really interesting investor coalitions, and I'm sure Shuyin can talk more to this, groups of asset owners that are signing diversity charters. There's lots of interesting shareholder activism happening in this place. I just read the other day that globally something like 70% of asset owners identify gender diversity as an area of interest. So clearly there is more to this than just the right thing to do. This is clearly about managing risk and ensuring you've got diversity in decision making, and you're making a breadth and diversity of investments, but also seizing a huge amount of opportunities that are coming through these businesses where they're female-led and founded.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe just to add on a little bit, and I'll also probably comment as kind of a private markets investor, right? Investing directly into companies, and maybe highlight the opportunities and kind of risk mitigation that we see, right? So I think at so many levels, right, that we see opportunities. I think definitely there are strong entrepreneurs out there, right, who, again, that horrifying statistic, 3%, right, who are not receiving funding due to kind of biases in the industry at large, right? That's a huge opportunity that we see we can tackle. I think the other big area where we have kind of found opportunities is untapped business opportunities for our portfolio companies, right? And then maybe I can give an example of that to make it a little bit more real. Because I think we don't see gender lens investing as stopping, say, at the investment decision, right? It's really something that carries through the portfolio management process all the way to exit. And actually, I think where we can actually have that a lot of change, right, is through using our role as board members or significant shareholders at these companies to really advocate for, hey, have you considered this, right? You're hiring a new C-suite position, how have you thought about getting a diverse slate of candidates, etc. And I would say, actually, I mean, in some cases for us, applying a gender lens has actually provided some really critical information about warning signs, right, or red flags, where we have ultimately ended up not closing a deal. And I think that's also been, I mean, that's a huge perhaps headache avoided, right, for us as investors by not getting into these particular risky investments, right, with strong gender risk. But I think in the spirit of this webinar,
Shuyin, am I able to?
Yeah.
Sorry to
Please.
interrupt, but I would love to just draw on that thread a little bit further and the examples of the red flags for you in that respect. Are there a few key things that you look out for in due diligence? There are specific questions where those red flags have actually come up and been really clear?
I think there's a few ones which I would say are maybe recurring themes in our work, right? So I think one of them is around, I think we always want to make sure, I mean, this is generally just good business practice, right? We generally want to make sure that the, entrepreneurs in the management team who are contributing the most to the business, right, are adequately incentivized, right, and rewarded, compensated for what they're doing. I think we have noticed in many cases, often the female say co-founders do have a smaller share of equity. I mean, I think there's also research supporting this, right? So I think often, like in some cases, we've actually spoken up about it, right, and restructured the cap table to give the female co-founders and managers kind of a more say equitable allocation of equity. So I think that's one thing that comes up a lot. And again, yep, it's the right thing to do, but then also there's a very practical consideration, because I certainly, wouldn't want these great talented leaders in the business to quit or get dissatisfied, right, because they are not, not incentivized. So I think that's one that we see quite a bit. I think there's also interesting, kind of say warning signs, red flags we can have maybe about the culture of a firm, right? And I think most of the businesses that we invest in, they're going to need to hire a lot of people, right, and attract a lot of talent to their team over the coming years. And I think if we see any kind of warning flags around the culture, which gender can certainly shine a light on, then that would be another big consideration for us. I think maybe one more area, there's so many, but I think is really, I think obviously it's so important that the entrepreneurs that we invest in understand their customer segment incredibly well, right? And I think it is sometimes a bit of a red flag for us if, firstly, if they don't even know the basic split, say the gender split of their customer base, that's quite simple information. But then beyond that, right, I think you can get an A+ if you actually know that within, say, your women customers, right, what are some of their different what are the different subsegments, right? What are some of the different needs, behaviors, right? Patterns in these segments or subsegments, right? That again can add real value to your business, right? If you know how to serve them well and kind of literally increase customer lifetime value, right? And all of these other very kind of business or commercial metrics that we care about as well. So those would be some examples.
When I hear you talking about all of those examples, it's really just pinkwashing, isn't it? Just like we've had greenwashing. I think certainly we get a lot of things come our way where they say, oh, this is gender focused because look, we have a woman. And it's clearly just a sort of a rebadging of what's a very generic standard type of product or fund. So, I think there is a little bit of that. You just need to make sure you're interrogating a little bit further, as Shuyin said, to understand how genuine it is actually in terms of the way things have been structured and how decisions are made.
Exactly.
One of the things I was thinking we haven't talked so much about is some of those more intentionally focused investments. And, this is really that sort of female-led venture portfolio that we're trying to build. And we do some direct investments in female founders and really, find that incredibly enjoyable, particularly where they are, tackling relevant issues for women and girls. We have ones like Circle in there, which is just, fantastic workplace platform to give better prompts to managers and better information to those that are parents and carers, or Applied, which is a platform to try and take the bias out of the recruitment process. These sorts of really great products being created by female founders. But because we're a small family office, really we've found it's better to find fantastic female fund managers who are really explicitly building this into what they're doing, and we can sort of support this more at scale. And so one of those that we're really enjoying being an anchor investor on is the Alia Via Fund, which is two fabulous Australian women who are based in the US, Marissa Warren and Kate Vale, and the fund is purely focused on female founders in both Australia and the US. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity, particularly for the Australian female founders, because often the next market that they want to go into is the US. So there's some great funds like that are starting to pop up. I would love to see some more in the Australian marketplace particularly. Certainly there's a raft of them in the US and in the UK and Europe, but I think we're starting to see some interesting ones. Some of you might have heard about the Artesian Fund, the Female Leaders Fund, which is currently fundraising. I don't know, Shuyin, you've probably got some great examples as well of what you're seeing, particularly in the Asia-Pac region.
Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. I think that there are, I think there's so many great, first-time female fund managers kind of emerging in Asia-Pac as well. And with really, I think the thing that always strikes me about these managers is that their investment theses are quite innovative, right? It's really so much more than, let's find a bunch of female entrepreneurs and invest in them, right? They're incredibly sharp around what kind of product, the market needs, right? From an investment perspective, what are the kind of, sectors, categories that are underserved. So I think that's what is, that's the inspiration and energy that I take, right, from engaging with this community. Yeah, maybe Rachel, back to you. I know we could chat all day. But,
no, this is I'm loving this because it's really interesting to hear about the way that you think about these investments, as well as doing the due diligence on the individual investments and the funds themselves and who makes the investment decisions. So before I jump into the next question, I will just jump in with a reminder to pop in your questions if you have any as they come to mind, because we'll get to Q&A shortly. But before we get there, the due diligence is one aspect, and we've touched on a bunch of different areas that you could apply gender lens investing. And so I'll pull it together with an example framework that was recently released by Capital Human and Impact Investing Australia that released a gender lens investing roadmap. So this is getting into the how part of the conversation to help people on the call start to implement bits and pieces. And so this framework talks about the 3 I's. So internal operations, investment processes, and influence on the system. So due diligence is part of the investment process, and the fund managers that are women that are making these decisions are involved in that kind of investment process. So that's one key area. Are there other frameworks that you use or starting points that you suggest to help people kind of start to break down these areas that they can start implementing targets for, or they can start implementing initiatives or processes to help them on their journey? Yeah, maybe I'll start with you, Shuyin.
Okay, yeah. On the investing side, I think it wasn't rocket science. I think what we did. So we had some guidance and help as well from the Criterion Institute, which is a kind of a think tank in the area of GLI. Basically, what we did was we broke down, so what's the investment process, right? There's sourcing, pipeline development, there's due diligence, there's structuring, there's portfolio management, and then there's exits, right? More or less. And for each of these different areas, and we probably don't have time to get deep into each one of them today, but essentially we looked at what we did, right? And we tried to understand how gender biases or considerations might pop into these different areas. So, for example, let's take sourcing, right? So we looked at, how we were getting deals, right? Which is through a combination, as you can imagine, of personal networks, right? Attending events, demo days, et cetera, right? But then we looked at okay, so people refer us a lot of deals. Who is that network who is referring us deals? What is the gender of those people, right? And do we have any kind of particular bias or are there very few women amongst that group, for example, and would that kind of skew the pipeline that we see? So I think that's just one example of thinking through, like, okay, how are we getting our deals, right? Is there an opportunity to get even better deals, right? If we broadened our networks, right? If we made it known, right, that we do apply a gender lens, right? This is something that's important to us. Could we actually attract, different entrepreneurs to actually come and approach us, right? So I think. So there's many different initiatives, but I think it all started with, like, hey, here's what we do today. Let's get some data, right, to understand, like, what's gender disaggregated data to understand, what's going on in this particular part of our pipeline development, and then take some concrete actions, right, to shake that up, basically. I think due diligence, I think for us, it really comes down to, we have a set of questions, right, or conversation starters that we use with all of our portfolio companies. We really didn't want to make it kind of a check the box kind of type of exercise that they could kind of just kind of tick very mindlessly about, what their gender percentages are. Although some of that data, I don't want to totally dismiss that data. Some of that data is important, but we really wanted to make it a richer conversation, right? To see how much they'd actually thought about these factors and could tell, give compelling arguments around them. So we have these discussions. Every investment team member is trained to basically have these conversations with the entrepreneurs that we work with. And then all the way through to exit. But I mean, if I were to summarize, it's like, look at your investment process. It's and then think through, where gender biases might kind of creep in, and and start with small kind of tangible actions, right? Like some of the things that I mentioned. And then might I just add, in terms of the results, it did actually dramatically change the composition of our pipeline and also our subsequent portfolios, right? I mean, I think we've dramatically increased the gender diversity in our portfolio, right? And hard to say exactly causation, but I mean, definitely there's a big correlation in some of these activities and the results that we had.
That was so comprehensive. I feel like that was a really good guide, Shuyin. I don't know that I have much more to add, really, because I think it is just about stepping back and looking at the way you do your investment processes, and then probably starting to just intentionally broaden your networks. I mean, I think there are some great networks focused on this, whether you are a fund manager or whether you're in a family office. There are the people here, but there is a much wider network starting to think about this and all learning together. I mean, we certainly haven't got this solved. We're figuring it out as we go, and we'd much rather do it with others. So I think it's just starting to perhaps hear about some of those gender-focused opportunities, and then just keep asking questions as you're looking at your investments.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. Speaking of questions, we might start to ask some of the questions from the audience. So I'll start with a question from Amanda. Are you able to give examples of gender targets that you set in terms of your investments? Are there specific numbers that you attach? I think, Sarah, you mentioned board composition as one. Are there others that you have that are specific numbers that have been set?
That's the only hard number that we've got. I guess because we've got these different types of investing, whether it's sort of more integrated or more intentional, it's a more agile approach. Look, there are certainly some really great methodologies out there that you can adopt, and you can. It's worth sort of having a look at on Gender Smart. There's lots of great examples, or Equileap, or there's lots of. Even Verve Super, they're really transparent about their methodology and how they invest and who they invest in. So there's lots of ways you can think about what those thresholds would be. I think it just really depends what you're aiming to undertake. What's the change you're trying to drive, or what are the most important metrics for you, or do you want to take a more holistic approach and start to sort of flow it through all of those different levels of investment?
Right. And any targets you'd like to point to, Shuyin?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to Sarah's approach, right? I mean, so I think on some of our funds, I mean, I guess the target is, 100% of our investments, right, are into women-owned, women-led businesses, right? So that's pretty clear. But I think on others, it is, a bit more of a nimble and agile approach, right? I mean, I think we definitely track the gender segregated data, but we don't have, specific targets at this stage, right? And we did, it was an interesting discussion. I mean, we did grapple a lot with, should we set them, should we not? Ultimately, we decided we wouldn't. But yeah, but it was definitely a hotly debated topic.
Yeah, useful to know. Another one, an interesting one that's come in from B Hung, that is, what do you think is standing in the way of gender lens investing becoming mainstream investing or business as usual? So perhaps Sarah, on your point before about it becoming mainstream, that's the ideal. What's stopping us from doing that now?
Well, I guess it's what's holding us back maybe with gender equity in general. It's, we just need a more critical mass of women in these decision-making roles helps. I think it's not been a priority focus more broadly in Australia for a little while. I think we're going to see that change with the new federal government and interesting initiatives happening in New South Wales and Victoria. So I think part of it is just that awareness raising, really demonstrating the commercial opportunity, and a lot of our focus is just how do we support more women to be part of this decision making, because you get more diverse decisions coming out of that process.
Oh, yeah. Definitely the education piece. So I think moving on to another question, a question from Hannah is, to sit before, alongside or after capital, how important is capability building in your work, both from an organisational and personal leadership perspective? And if you engage in capability building, how do you deliver it? So Shuyin, you touched on this a bit about ensuring your team knows how to kind of ask the right questions and understands, what you're trying to achieve. How do you think about this?
Yeah, I think from our own internal organizational perspective, I think capability building was really important, right? I mean, I think GLI or implementing GLI is like a change management exercise, right? So I think it takes, leadership, and I think also capability building. So we were very fortunate in our case to have the support of Investing in Women and the Criterion Institute, as I mentioned, to kind of help us along that journey and deliver some of this training, for us in the initial days. And I think once we got into the groove, we were able to take more of that, in-house ourselves and kind of train and onboard new, every say incoming team member, right, at Patamar does have, GLI training, right, when they start, delivered by, I guess, us now who hopefully have learned a few things along the way, right, of this process. I think the other important piece, and I think Hannah might have been alluding to this as well, is really for the portfolio companies as well. I think that is an important part of I think our work. As I mentioned, I mean, we're really I think we are very active board members at our portfolio companies, and certainly it means more than showing up at a board meeting once every quarter. I think we really do try and be advocates for GLI, on a consistent and continuous basis in our relationships with the companies. We do also have, I guess, a technical assistance program, right? That's still at a pretty small scale, but I think we certainly do recognize the need, particularly for the businesses who are more maybe in the so-called like missing middle, right, of companies, to receive additional dedicated support. And I think some of that is specifically around gender and the intersection of gender and leadership, right, and is meant to be of support to these female leaders, right, as they scale a business for the first time, right, and then grapple with all of the challenges and ups and downs that come with that. So I think, in short, it is important. It always is a bit of a balance or a balancing act, I would have to admit, as a fund manager, how much we get involved in capability building, right, versus sticking to our core of funds management, right? So I think that's always I think we do acknowledge they're both important, but I think obviously if we did kind of get too focused on, say, doing capability building, then people might start asking questions like, hey, are you really an investment firm, or are you more of a consulting firm, right? So I think that's one thing we do have to be mindful of, while recognizing the importance of it, especially in the markets that we operate in.
Yeah. And that ties to the next question, which is around whether having a gender lens investment focus has actually proven to benefit you as an investor? Are you seeing more investments because they value that input that you can have in the companies and have that influence and education and gender lens investing at the board level? Is that helpful to attracting portfolio companies?
That's more. Okay. So I think it is helpful at two levels, right? Because I think there's both. Is it helpful at attracting, I guess, limited partners, right, investors into our funds? I would say it's a mixed bag to me. I mean, again, like we'll speak really frankly here amongst friends, right? I think definitely there is a group of limited partners who care strongly about GLI, and I think it has helped us tap into those sources of capital. I think again, unfortunately, it is not all, like, I wouldn't say it's a turn off, but maybe it's simply not that interesting, right, to still another group of limited partners. I think that's the unfortunate reality at the moment. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think it can mobilize additional capital, and I think the amount of I think capital that cares about I think GLI more broadly is definitely increasing, but it's certainly not by no means everyone. And I think in terms of does it help attract kind of investees, right, to our portfolio because they know that we care about these issues? I would say yes, right. I think in the same way that a lot of entrepreneurs want to partner with Patamar because they see that kind of impact and broader vision alignment. I think alignment on gender as well is something that that certainly resonates with a lot of the entrepreneurs that we invest in.
And Sarah, perhaps I'll throw the next one to you about strategies that you've put in place with portfolio companies or funds to help them improve gender diversity. Have you helped people that you've invested in to do that? Are you active in the same way that Shuyin is around that kind of board role or that involvement from the kind of gender education perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I guess where we're more actively involved in the investments tends to be where they're female founders and really just backing them and finding all sorts of ways to support them and their business to flourish. I guess, Trawalla has a lot of experience and individuals we can draw on to support that. I guess for those that are transitioning, look, we tend to be more, it's the frank conversation up front about why we won't invest, because this is a missing piece and they should be really thinking about that and coming back to us. And that certainly, we have seen that shift over time. So, in terms of products and what they're offering. I guess for us, the certainly thinking about the capability building that we were just discussing before. When we're building this female-led venture portfolio, a big focus for us is how do we support the ecosystem more broadly, because we actually want to see this flourish in Australia in general. We want to bring, see more investors at the table, more of that mainstream capital. We want more female fund managers. We want more female founders. We just want all of that ecosystem to flourish. And so we're really looking at how can we bring others on that journey with us so we can all learn together? How can we learn from best practice overseas? So we've intentionally invested in some of the bigger female founder-led funds internationally, just so we can see how they run, how do they report, what are they focused on, all those sorts of aspects. There's some great global sort of coalitions and networks, things like Beyond the Billion, where they're really getting funds to sign up to be part of shifting capital towards female founders. So that's the piece that we're really thinking more and more deeply about, and how can we bring as much of that back to Australia as possible to really accelerate what's happening here.
So to ask the next question from Elisa, just drawing on that thread, is where do you think the new female fund managers will come from if we want this to grow quickly? Do we need to kind of bring people in from overseas, or is it about upskilling people that are already here in Australia? How do you think this field will grow of women-led kind of fund managers?
I think they're already there, but they actually need to be supported. They need to be given the opportunity and the capital, is my view. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to back some of these first first fund managers who are having difficulty getting the capital in ways that you don't see their male peers experiencing in quite the same way. So, part of it is supporting networks of female fund managers here, giving, it's not so much the confidence, but just sort of that backing to get on with it. I think it's just seeking out. There are high-performing female fund managers here already.
And may I say, I think one really catalytic, an important thing to do on, in supporting kind of, female fund managers who, first-time fund managers as well in some cases, right? Not the first time they're investing, but maybe the first time they're, right? Which is a very important thing to remember. Yeah. But the first time that they're maybe, in the driver's seat, right, of a new fund. I think a really important thing for these fund managers, and I guess we're kind of one of them in some ways, is to receive that kind of initial anchor commitment, right, from backers. And I think those brave, foundations or, private investors or who are able to make that initial, show like, hey, this is a strategy worth backing. I think that initial anchor commitment can be really what gets these funds off the ground and enables them to scale, right? Because everyone's like, oh, but like they don't have scale yet. But I'm like, they have to start somewhere, right? And they start, and they will grow because I think that they have such, just amazing and innovative strategies as we've been talking about in the conversation.
That's great. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I just want to thank you both, Shuyin and Sarah, for the incredible insights you've shared today. Some really practical tips and some ways to get started, some great frameworks as well that have been shared here today to help people get started and to hopefully better understand what gender lens investing is all about.